The words hit Helena Ward like a door shut in her face. "You are not to speak of her in my presence." The Duke of Ashburton stood with his back to her, facing a window that looked out over the winter-grey lawns of Ashburton Hall. He had not turned when she entered. He did not turn now. His silhouette was a clean black line against the pale December light, and his voice, when he spoke, carried the particular flatness of a man who had rehearsed this sentence many times and no longer heard it. "Not to Lady Margaret. Not to the staff. Not to me." He paused. "My wife is not a subject of conversation in this house. If you find that unreasonable." "The door behind you is still open." Helena said nothing. She had expected coldness. The letter from Ashburton Hall had been brief to the point of insult. "Your sister's widower requires a companion for his aunt. Your name was suggested. The position is yours if you can observe the rules of this house." Old Aunt had contained no greeting, no condolence, no acknowledgement of Eleanor beyond that single possessive phrase, as though he were claiming a title rather than referencing a marriage. She had read it 3 times. And each time her jaw had tightened a little more, but she had not expected this. Not to speak of her. She had come to Ashburton Hall to speak of nothing else. The sister she had never truly known, Eleanor, 11 years her senior, born of their mother's first marriage. Sent to a finishing school in Bath when Helena was still learning to read, had existed for her only in fragments. A wedding notice in the Morning Post, a miniature portrait sent at Christmas that their mother had pressed to her chest and wept over and never explained. A letter in an elegant hand that arrived once a year and said nothing specific about anything. When the notice of Eleanor's death arrived 3 years ago, Helena had wept too, in the way one weeps for an absence that has simply become permanent rather than temporary. And then, 6 months later, the whispers began, not accusations. Society was too careful for that. But the words people chose: tragic, unexplained, that poor woman who was never quite well, and then, lower, between fans and over teacups. But one does wonder what went on in that house had assembled themselves in Helena's mind into a picture she could not look away from. The Duke had retreated from London. The invitations stopped. The name Ashburton became a thing spoken with a particular careful neutrality that meant the opposite of neutral. Helena had spent 2 years asking questions. She had read every account she could find. She had written letters to acquaintances who had moved in the edges of Ashburton's circle and received replies that said nothing directly and implied everything obliquely. The evidence was circumstantial. But a man who could not speak of his wife's death, who had sealed himself into a country house for 3 years and refused all society, was not a man with a clear conscience. So when the letter came, she had not hesitated. She was 24 years old, widowed at 22. With no children and an inheritance that the solicitor had described, with careful sympathy, as sufficient for the immediate term. But those were not the reasons she had travelled 3 days in a hired coach to reach Devon in December. She had come because Eleanor had no one else to ask the questions. She had come because someone had to make him speak, and now he was telling her that anything she had come for was the one thing she was not permitted to do. She studied his back, the rigid set of his shoulders, the hand resting against the window frame with the fingers pressed too hard into the wood. The way he was holding himself very still, in the manner of a man who has learned that stillness is the only thing between himself and something he cannot afford. He is afraid, she thought, and the thought surprised her. Not of me. Of her name. That I understand, Your Grace, she said. He turned then. And for the first time she saw his face. He was 34, she knew that from the parish records she had found, but he looked older, the lines around his mouth cut too deep. The grey in his eyes, the particular colourless grey of winter sky that has forgotten what it looked like before the clouds came. He looked at her the way people looked at things they were trying not to recognize. You understand what, exactly? That I am not to speak of her. He was silent for a moment. Something moved in his expression, not quite suspicion, not quite something else. Then you may stay, he said at last. Lady Margaret will explain your duties. You will find she speaks enough for several people. So your silence on the subject I've mentioned should not create any particular absence. He turned back to the window. The interview, apparently, was over. Helena picked up her travelling bag and moved toward the door. Her hand was on the latch when his voice came again lower, now. And directed at the glass rather than at her. As though he had not intended to speak at all, there is a portrait of her in the East Gallery. They tell me it is a good likeness. A pause. I would not know. I have not gone there in 3 years. But you may. He stopped. The next words came out as though extracted by force. You may visit. If you wish. You may be near her, even if I cannot. Helena stood very still with her hand on the latch. You may be near her. She had come to Ashburton Hall expecting to find a man whose guilt would announce itself in cruelty, in coldness. In the small casual brutalities of power. She had not expected these, a man who had forbidden her name in every room of his house and then, in the same breath, given Helena a key to the one room where she still existed. She opened the door without answering. She walked into the corridor and did not look back, but as she followed a housemaid toward the east wing, one thought settled in her like a stone dropped into still water. He cannot speak of her. But I can make him. Lady Margaret Ashburton was not what Helena had anticipated. She had prepared herself for an elderly woman of strict propriety who would require companionship in the form of card games and embroidery and carefully neutral conversation. What she found instead, in a sitting room crowded with cut flowers in December and at least 4 cats of varying temperament, was a woman of 70 who rose from her chair with the energy of someone half her age, seized both of Helena's hands, and said, without preamble, "You have her eyes. Not the color, yours are darker, but the shape. The way they sit in your face. It's quite remarkable." Helena had no answer to this. She had never been compared to Eleanor before. She was not certain she had ever been compared to anyone. "Come and sit down," Lady Margaret said, releasing her hands and gesturing toward a chair with the confidence of a woman who had never once doubted whether her gestures would be obeyed. "I've had tea brought. You've just survived an interview with my nephew, which means you either need something warm or something considerably stronger. And as it is not yet noon, I shall assume the former." Helena sat. One of the cats immediately climbed into her lap and settled there with the confidence of prior ownership. "That is Aristotle," Lady Margaret said, pouring tea with a steady hand. "He is a poor judge of character and I apologize for him in advance. Now." She set down the teapot and looked at Helena directly. In the manner of someone who had decided that looking directly at things was the most efficient approach to them. "I expect Julian told you not to mention Eleanor." "That he did. That he tells everyone that." She offered Helena a cup. "He told the vicar. He told 3 separate solicitors. He once told a hound T. Had wandered in from the grounds and showed no signs of being capable of speech. It has become something of a reflex." She paused. "I say this not to make light of it. I say it so that you understand that the rule is not about you specifically." Helena accepted the cup. "May I ask, was she very ill?" Toward the end, Lady Margaret was quiet for a moment in the way that people are quiet when they are deciding not how much to say but in which order to say it. "She was," she said at last. "For the last 2 years. She found it very difficult. Sounds distressed her. Touch distressed her. She set her own cup down without drinking from it. There are names for what she had, I'm told, though the doctors at the time were not in agreement about what those names were. What it meant, practically, was that the world became very loud for her. Very present. Things that other people don't notice." "The portrait in the East Gallery," Helena said. "He said he hasn't been there in 3 years, that he hasn't been to a great many places." Lady Margaret looked at her hands. "He sat in the corridor outside her room the night she died. All night. She had asked him not to come in toward the very end. She found even familiar presences difficult, and so he sat in the corridor, on the floor, with his back against the wall. Until morning." She looked up. "I tell you this not because it explains everything. It doesn't. But I find that people tend to form their opinions of Julian based on what he does in public, which is very little and very badly managed. And I prefer that the people who live in this house have access to at least some of what he does in private." Helena thought of the letter. "Your sister's widower." The words had struck her, when she first read them, as a kind of cold efficiency. A refusal to grant Eleanor even the dignity of being named. Now she thought they might have been something else entirely, a man who could not write her name without something happening to him that he could not explain to a solicitor. She left something for you, Lady Margaret said. And reached into the drawer of the small table beside her chair. She produced a small envelope, slightly worn at the corners, sealed with plain wax. Helena's name was written on the front in a hand she did not recognize. Fine, careful letters that slanted slightly to the left. She wrote it during her last winter. Lady Margaret said. She gave it to me and asked me to. She paused. She asked me to use my judgment about when to give it. I've been using my judgment for 3 years. She held it out. I think now is right. But you don't have to read it today. Helena took the envelope. It was lighter than she expected. 1 sheet, perhaps, or 2. It'll wait, she said, though she was not certain why. Lady Margaret nodded as though this were the correct answer. Julian has a habit of making the house feel like a verdict, she said. It isn't one. It's just a house with too many closed doors. She picked up her teacup. Your room is in the south wing. Aristotle will show you the way if you let him. Goes there regardless of whether he's wanted. The cat in Helena's lap opened one eye, as though aware he had been mentioned. And then closed it again. The book slipped from the shelf before Helena touched it. She had been reaching for the volume beside it, a dry text on estate management that Lady Margaret had asked her to locate when her sleeve caught the spine of its neighbor, and the book fell, landing open on the floor with a sound like a small, definitive argument. Helena picked it up. It was a medical text. The title was long and Latin and she could only partially parse it, but the words nervous system appeared in the subtitle, and below that, in smaller type, on the classification and treatment of disorders of sensation. The publication date on the frontispiece was 1812. She looked at the shelf from which it had fallen. The volumes were arranged with a consistency that the rest of the library did not share. Same height. Same binding style. She counted 11 of them, and when she pulled the nearest one out and checked the flyleaf, she found a date October 1813 and a bookseller's stamp from a London shop she did not recognize. The volume beside it, March 1814. The one after, July 1814. She did not need to check the others to understand the sequence. Eleanor had been diagnosed in the spring of 1813. Helena stood in the library for a long moment, holding the October volume. The pages were worn at the edges in the way that pages became worn when they were turned many times and not always carefully. There were pencil marks in the margins, not annotations, exactly. More like the traces of a reader who had pressed too hard without intending to write anything. The ghost of attention. She put the book back. She straightened the spine so that it aligned with the others. She had come to this library to find an estate management text. She had no reason to think about who had ordered these books or how many times they had been read. A man who had wanted his wife to suffer would not have spent 2 years acquiring medical literature on the nature of her suffering. She was aware that this thought did not exonerate him of anything specific. She was also aware that it sat in her chest differently than she had expected. She found the estate management TEXT on the shelf below and had nearly reached the door when it opened and the Duke walked in. He stopped when he saw her. It was a very small stop, the pause of a man who had expected an empty room and recalibrated in an instant, and then he continued moving. Crossing to his desk without acknowledging her presence. I found the Cavendish you asked Lady Margaret about, Helena said, holding up the estate text. She thought it might be on the lower shelves. Leave it on the table. She set it down. She was nearly at the door again when she paused. And because she was not certain she would be able to hold the question in for the remaining weeks of her time here, she said. The books on the upper left shelf. The medical ones. The Duke's hand stilled on the papers he had been reaching for. A brief stillness. The kind that arrived before a decision. That shelf doesn't need cataloging. He said that I wasn't cataloging it. One of the books fell, then it can be replaced if it was damaged. He picked up his papers. That will be all. Helena left at in the corridor. She stood for a moment with her back against the wall, looking at nothing in particular. Her heart was doing something irregular. She recognized it, after a moment, as the feeling of a theory beginning to require revision. The Carsworth evening party was not, strictly speaking, a ball. Lady Carsworth had described it in her invitation as an informal gathering of friends, which Helena had come to understand, in the 3 weeks since her arrival in Bath, meant approximately 60 people in formal dress consuming champagne and performing sociability at one another with the focused energy of people who had nothing else to do with their evenings. Lady Margaret had insisted they attend. "Julian needs to be seen," she had said, in the tone she used when she had already decided something and was providing Helena with the courtesy of an explanation. "He has been not seen for 3 years." Which people have been interpreting in a variety of unflattering directions. "An evening in company will not fix this. But it is a beginning." The Duke had said nothing to this. He had, however, appeared at the appointed time in the appointed carriage, which Helena had come to recognize as his particular form of consent. Now he stood at the far end of the Carsworths' drawing room, near the windows, holding a glass of wine he had not drunk and speaking to no one. He had the quality, Helena noticed, of a man who could be entirely still in a crowded room in a way that made the crowded room seem to be moving around him rather than the reverse. She did not look at him for long. She had her own problems, Miss Ward. The voice came from her left, and she turned to find a face she recognized from another life. Caroline Fitch, whose family had lived 3 streets from Helena's in London before Helena's father died and everything changed shape. Caroline's expression moved through several registers in rapid succession before settling on a careful, social smile. "What a surprise. I didn't know you were in Bath." "That I arrived recently," Helena said. "In with Lady Margaret Ashburton." Something happened to Caroline's careful smile. It became more careful. "Oh," she said. How interesting." She glanced, very briefly, in the Duke's direction. "You must bet hat is, I suppose Lady Margaret required." She stopped. "Rearranged. Are you well?" "It's been such a long time." "Very well, thank you." "And you're staying at Ashburton Hall?" "Yes, that I see." Caroline's fan opened and closed once. "Well, it was lovely to see you." And she was gone, absorbed back into the gathering with the smooth efficiency of someone who had decided that a conversation was over. Helena watched her go. She had expected something like this. She had not expected that the specific shape of it. Rapid calculation behind Caroline's eyes. The careful repositioning of the smile would feel quite so much like being measured and found to weigh less than she had previously. She turned toward the window. The Duke was still at the far end of the room. He was not looking at her. He was looking, with complete apparent attention, at the middle distance somewhere above the heads of the Carsworth's other guests, his glass still untouched, and then, for a span of perhaps 3 seconds, he looked at her. It was not a glance. It was not the casual sweeping attention of someone surveying a room. It was a direct, specific, fully arrived look, and it lasted precisely long enough for Helena to register it before his gaze moved on, unhurried, to the window beyond her shoulder. Helena turned back to face the room. Her ribs felt oddly arranged. She told herself he had been checking that she was observing the terms of her employment, not speaking of Eleanor, not drawing attention, not complicating his evening. She told herself this was surveillance and not something else, because surveillance was a thing she had prepared for and the other thing was not. A waiter passed with a tray. She took a glass of something and held it across the room. A woman laughed at something another woman had said, the sound bright and carrying. The chandelier threw light in irregular patterns across the ceiling. The Duke returned his attention to the middle distance, and his glass remained, to Helena's knowledge, untouched for the rest of the evening. In the carriage home, no one spoke. Lady Margaret had fallen asleep almost immediately, or was performing sleep with considerable commitment. Helena looked at the passing dark outside the window. The Duke sat across from her with his arms folded and his eyes also directed at the window, though there was nothing to see. After some time, and without turning from the window, he said, "Mrs. Fitch found you." "I assume she did. She finds everyone. She is very committed to the project of knowing things." A pause. "Whatever she said to you, or implied, or communicated through the precise angle of her fan. I would recommend treating it as data about her rather than about any other subject. Helena looked at his profile against the dark glass. She didn't say very much. No. She rarely needs to. He was quiet for a moment. Then. You managed the evening adequately. Helena was not certain whether this was a compliment or an evaluation. She decided it was probably both, and that she did not have enough information yet to know what either was worth coming from him. Thank you, she said. That he nodded once. Still looking at the window, and said nothing further. Outside, the Devon countryside moved past in darkness, and Helena thought about a shelf of medical books with worn pages and press marks in the margins, and about a man who sat in a corridor all night because he had been asked to. And about the particular way that 3 seconds of direct attention could rearrange a theory you had been building for 2 years. She did not resolve any of this before the carriage reached Ashburton Hall. She did not expect to. It was the 3rd week of January before Lady Margaret spoke of Elia. Nor again. They were in the small sitting room that faced the kitchen garden. Lady Margaret's preferred room in winter, she had explained. Because the pipes ran close to the walls and it was the only room in the house that could be relied upon to stay warm without a fire that required tending. She was doing something complicated with embroidery thread that Helena had stopped trying to follow. Helena was writing letters. Or performing the act of writing letters, which mostly involved holding a pen and thinking about other things. She used to sit in that chair, Lady Margaret said, without looking up from her work. Helena looked at the chair she was sitting in. It was an ordinary chair. Blue upholstery. Slightly faded at the arms. That I can move. No, please don't. Lady Margaret's needle went through the fabric and back again. I mention it because I like it. It would have made her happy, I think. To know someone was using it. A pause. She worried about that. About things going unused. About rooms being closed up. Another pause, longer. She worried about a great many things. Toward the end, Helena set her pen down. Lady Margaret, she said carefully. When she died she stopped. Conscious of the rule, and then continued anyway, because Lady Margaret had been the one to begin this. Was it were those of you who were there? Were you with her? I was in the house, Lady Margaret said. In this room, as it happens. It was July, and warm. And I had the windows open. She looked up from her embroidery. Julian was in the corridor outside her door. He had been there for most of the night. That he told me there was a rule. That she didn't want. She couldn't bear to be touched. Toward the very end. Or to have people close. Lady Margaret's voice was precise. The precision of someone choosing words the way a surgeon chose instruments. It had become, the world had become very overwhelming for her. Even familiar things. Even voices she knew. The doctor said it was part of the progression. That it would have happened regardless. She looked back at her embroidery. She asked him, in the last weeks, not to come into the room. He honored that. Helena thought of the man she had watched stand at a window for an entire interview rather than look at her. She thought of medical books with worn pages. He's never told anyone that. She said. That he was in the corridor. Know the people in Bath, the things they say about why she. Yes. Lady Margaret's needle stilled. I have asked him, more than once. To simply explain. To say something that will recalibrate the story that has been going around for 3 years. He refuses. She was quiet for a moment. He says that explaining would require him to describe her condition in terms that she would not have wished to be described. That she valued her PR. Ivaki. That she was not a subject to be deployed in his defense. Her needle moved again. Which is entirely characteristic of him and entirely maddening. Helena sat with this for a long moment. And you, she said. You believe. I believe, Lady Margaret said. With the finality of someone closing a door gently but completely, that my nephew spent 2 years trying to find a way to help his wife that would not cause her pain, and that he failed. And that he has been punishing himself for that failure ever since. She set her embroidery down in her lap and looked at Helena directly. I believe that the story people tell about him in Bath is wrong in every particular that matters. And I believe that you came here knowing that story. And that you are now, I hope, beginning to have some doubts about it." Helena said nothing. Lady Margaret picked up her embroidery again. "Eleanor would have liked you," she said. "She would have found you very difficult to manage. Which is the thing she most appreciated in people." The needle went through the fabric. "She told me once that she regretted not knowing you better. She said she had been a coward about it had seemed easier to keep her two lives separate, and that by the time she understood that was a mistake. She no longer had the energy to correct it." The kitchen garden outside the window was bare in the January light, the beds covered with frost. Helena looked at her unfinished letter on the table. "I'll read it soon," she said. "The letter she left, when you're ready," Lady Margaret said. "There is no hurry. She waited 3 years. She can wait a little longer." The second time Helena attended a Bath assembly, she wore a dress she did not particularly like because it was the warmest one she owned, and she arrived resolved to observe rather than to participate. Which lasted approximately 20 minutes before a man named Barlow found her near the punch bowl and decided she was interesting, that he was not unattractive and not unintelligent, and he had the quality, which Helena had observed in several people since arriving in Bath, of asking questions that were shaped like interest but functioned as collection. "You're with Lady Margaret Ashburton," he said, handing her a glass with the ease of someone establishing a debt. "I didn't know she had taken on a companion recently," Helena said. "Remarkable woman. I've known her for years." He smiled. "The Duke is here tonight as well, I see. That's rather more unusual. That I wouldn't know. I haven't been in Bath long enough to establish what's usual. Oh, he almost never comes out. 3 years now. More or less the odd appearance here and there, enough to prove he's still alive, and then back to Devon." Barlow glanced across the room in the Duke's direction, the glance calibrated to look casual. "One hears things, of course." Helena waited. "About the first Duchess," Barlow continued. "When it became apparent she was not going to ask. Her death. The manner of it. The circumstances." He let the word sit. "Of course, no one knows precisely. That's rather the trouble. When a man refuses to explain himself, people feel obliged to explain him instead. That seems like a problem with people rather than with the man." Barlow's eyebrows rose slightly. He reassessed her. She could see it, filing her into a different category than the one he had originally prepared. "Quite possibly," he said. "Though I'd argue that reputation has its own logic, independent of the truth it's nominally tracking." He smiled again. "But I suspect you know something about that. Ward, your late husband was in trade, wasn't he? Bristol, if I recall." Helena looked at him. "Yes," she said pleasantly. "He was, forgive me, don't mean any." "No," she said. "Of course not." She excused herself 5 minutes later on the grounds that she had promised Lady Margaret something to drink, which was untrue but structurally useful. She collected 2 glasses from the nearest tray and was crossing toward the windows when the Duke materialized at her shoulder with the abruptness of a man who had been watching her for long enough to time his approach. "Barlow," he said. "Not a question that he was very informative." Helena said that he is always informative. "He is the most informative man in Bath, which is not a recommendation." He fell into step beside her, which was unexpected. "He will have told you a variety of things about me, most of which will have been framed as concerned inquiry rather than gossip, which is how he prefers to operate." That he mentioned your wife. A pause. "Brief. He always does," the Duke said. They had reached the windows. Helena offered him one of the glasses she was carrying because it seemed rude not to, and he took it, which surprised her. "Whatever he suggested," the Duke said, looking out at the assembly room, "he doesn't know what he's talking about. Not because the truth is better than the story he's telling, but because he doesn't have enough information to be telling any story at all." He paused. "That is not a denial. Before you interpret it as one, it is a statement about epistemology. That I understand the difference." Helena said that he looked at her. Thina quick, sideways look, the same quality as the one in the Carsworth drawing room, arriving and departing before she could fully account for it. Barlow is also, he said, after a moment, a man who will repeat anything he learns within 48 hours to everyone he knows, with improvements. If you told him something in confidence this evening, it will be common knowledge by Thursday. A pause. I mention this in case it affects what you choose to tell him in future. That I told him my husband was in trade, Helena said. He already knew. That's not what I meant. That I know, she said. But it's all I told him. The Duke was quiet for a moment. Across the room, a small ensemble had begun playing something that the guests were not quite dancing to, moving instead in a social approximation of dancing that committed to nothing. You managed him well, the Duke said. That it was. Helena thought, the second time he had used that phrase about her performance in a social setting. She was beginning to think it was not entirely about her performance in social settings. You were watching, she said. That I watch most things, he said. It is a habit I developed in lieu of participating. He set his glass down on the windowsill. Still half full. Lady Margaret will be ready to leave in approximately 20 minutes. She reaches a threshold at these events and then declines rapidly. I'd suggest finding her before she reaches the threshold rather than after. He moved away into the room before she could respond. Absorbed into the gathering with the ease of a man who knew exactly how to be present without being available, Helena stood at the window with her 2 glasses and watched him go. She thought, he has been watching me across 2 rooms on 2 separate evenings. And both times he has been the one to move away first. She thought, that is not surveillance. She did not know what to do with the thought, so she went to find Lady Margaret. The East Gallery was longer than Helena had expected. It ran the full length of the house's original wing. Before the later additions had altered the building's geometry, and its windows faced north, which meant the light that came through them was the particular cool, unbiased light that painters were said to prefer, light that showed things as they were rather than as the warmer hours of the day made them appear. The portraits that lined the walls were mostly ancestors, men in ruffs, women in improbable hats. The occasional hunting scene in which the dogs looked more alert than their owners. Eleanor was at the far end. Helena had known she would be. She had been putting off this walk for 6 weeks, telling herself she was waiting for the right moment. And then telling herself there was no right moment, and then continuing to wait anyway. Now it was a Tuesday morning in February, the house was quiet, and she had run out of reasonable objections. The portrait was larger than she had expected. Life-size, nearly. Eleanor seated in a chair by a window. Her hands folded in her lap, wearing a dress the color of late summer sky. The painter had been skilled. The face looking back at Helena was a face she recognized from the miniature their mother had kept, but rendered with a specificity that the miniature had lacked. The slight asymmetry of the mouth, the way the eyes held a quality of attention that was also, somehow, a quality of distance present and careful and not quite reachable. Helena stood in front of the portrait for a long time, she had told herself, over the 6 weeks since she arrived. That Eleanor was a means to an end. A subject of inquiry. The center of a situation that needed to be understood. She had been careful not to think of her as a person she had failed to know. Because that thought had an edge to it that she did not want to run her hand along. Standing in front of the portrait, she found the thought anyway. You sent me a letter every Christmas, she thought. You wrote that you were well and that you hoped I was well, and you never said anything true, and I never asked you to. She reached out, without quite deciding to, and touched the gilded edge of the frame. Something shifted under her fingers. That it was slight. The frame was old, and the backing had loosened over time, and when her fingers pressed against the lower left corner a small gap opened between the canvas and the wooden back panel. Helena would not have thought anything of it, except that in the gap she could see a corner of something pale, something thin. Something that was not part of the portrait's backing material. She stood there for a moment, then she reached into the gap and drew it out. That it was a notebook small, the size of a hand. Its cover plain brown leather, worn soft with use. The pages were dense with writing in the careful leftward slant she recognized from the envelope Lady Margaret had given her. She held it for a long moment, aware that she was making a decision simply by continuing to hold it. And then she sat down on the bench across from the portrait and opened it. The early entries were sparse. Dates and weather and brief notations. Bad night, could not sleep, the sound of the rain on the roof window was too much, and then longer passages as the entries progressed. The writing growing smaller and more compressed. As though the writer had become concerned about running out of space, Helena turned pages carefully. He brought me flowers from the garden today. I asked him to leave them outside the door. I could hear him set them down. He didn't say anything. I don't know if he understood that I wasn't refusing I was refusing the smell, the presence of cut stems. The way they would have made the room feel occupied by something I couldn't control. I don't know how to explain this. I don't know how to explain any of it in terms that make sense to someone who does not live inside a body that has decided the world is too loud. Helena turned more pages. February. The entry said. And then March, today he tried to help me stand. I had been trying to rise from the chair for several minutes, and I could see that it was difficult for him to watch and do nothing. Julian has never been a man who could watch difficulty without wanting to resolve it. He put his hand under my arm. Lena's breath slowed. I don't know how to describe what happened next except to say that it was not his fault and was also completely beyond my ability to prevent. My body simply refused. The sensation of his hand weighs it was too much. Everything contracted. I heard myself making a sound I did not choose. To make. I saw his face. I want to write about his face, but I find I cannot. I will only say, he stepped back as though he had done something unforgivable, when what he had done was try to help me, and I have not been able to make him understand the difference. And I am not certain I have the words or the breath or the time left to try. I want to tell him it was not his fault. I want to tell him that his hands are gentle. I have always known his hands are gentle. I am afraid that if I tell him, he will believe me. And then he will be free to stop punishing himself, free to leave the corridor he has been sitting in, free to eventually, someday, be somewhere that is not grief. And I find that I am not, even now, entirely unselfish about this. I am afraid of him being free. I am ashamed of this fear. But I am writing it here because it is true, and the only thing I have left to offer anyone is true things. That I am being selfish. I know I am being selfish. I hope, when he is free, that he will forgive me for it. The last entry was dated 3 days before Eleanor's death. There is a letter for him. I gave it to Margaret to keep. I asked her to use her judgment about when to give it. I think I asked this because I knew that if I was given a choice I would keep asking for more time to find the right words, and there are no right words, and I have run out of time to look for them. The letter says what needs to be said. I hope he believes it. I think he won't, not at first. But perhaps eventually, if she ever comes. The necklace is yours. I should have written to you properly years ago. I was a coward about it. I am sorry. Helena closed the notebook. She sat in the cool north light of the east gallery for a long time. Above her, Eleanor looked out of the portrait with that quality of careful, distant attention. If she ever comes, she had not known, until this moment, that Eleanor had expected her. That somewhere in the calculations of a woman running out of time, Helena had appeared not as an afterthought, not as a distant half-sibling to be managed, but as someone who might eventually come. Looking, the notebook was still in her hands. The frame of the portrait was slightly ajar where she had opened it. The light through the north windows was pale and exact and showed everything clearly. She became aware, after some time, that she was not alone. She did not hear him enter. The Duke moved quietly for a large man, but she felt the quality of the air in the gallery change. The way it changed when a room that had been empty became occupied. She looked up. He was standing in the doorway. He was looking at the notebook in her hands. The expression on his face was not anger. It was something that had passed through anger on the way to somewhere more complicated. I did. Know it was there, Helena said. It fell. He was touching the frame, and the backing had come loose, and she stopped. I read it. I had no right to. But I read it. He did not move. How much? He said, all of it. That he came into the gallery then. Not toward her, toward the portrait. He stood in front of it with his back to her. the same posture as the window in his study on the first day. And Helena had the sense that this was the only way he knew how to stand when something was happening that he did not know how to hold. "You should go," he said. She said it wasn't your fault. His shoulders did not move. Nothing moved, she didn't know. He said, she knew. Helena stood up from the bench. Her voice was steadier than she had expected. She wrote it down. She described exactly what happened. She knew what had occurred and she knew why. And she knew it was not something you caused. She was. Helena stopped. She thought of I am afraid that if I tell him, he will be free. She thought of I am being selfish. She thought of the weight of information she was carrying that he did not have and was not sure she was permitted to give him all at once. She knew, she said again. She couldn't find the right words. And she ran out of time to look for them. The silence in the gallery was the specific silence of a sentence landing in a place that has been waiting for it for a long time. Go. He said. The word came out differently than it had the first time. Not a command. Something closer to a request. Helena went at I in the corridor outside. She stood with her back against the wall and held the notebook against her chest and breathed. From inside the gallery there was no sound. No movem. Ent. Only the quality of a silence that was doing something to itself, reshaping around a new piece of information, trying to decide what shape it would take. She did not know how long she stood there. Eventually she walked back to her room, sat at her desk, and took out the envelope Lady Margaret had given her on the first day. She opened it. The letter inside was 2 pages in Eleanor's careful hand, and it said, among other things, exactly what Helena had told the Duke it said. She read it twice, then she folded it carefully and held it in both hands and thought about a man sitting on a corridor floor all night, and a shelf of medical books, and 3 seconds of attention across a crowded room. And she understood that she had come to Ashburton Hall to find a murderer and had instead found something considerably more difficult to know what to do with. She did not see him for 2 days. This was not unusual. The Duke moved through Ashburton Hall on schedules and routes that remained opaque. Oh Helena, but after the East Gallery it had a different texture. The absence felt deliberate in a way it had not before. On the 3rd day she encountered him in the corridor outside the library. He was coming out as she was going in. And there was a moment of the particular social geometry that occurred when 2 people in a narrow space both moved in the same direction to accommodate each other and then both moved back. He stopped. She stopped. Miss Ward. He said, Your Grace. That he looked at her. The light in the corridor was the dim indoor light of winter, and it did not flatter anyone, and he looked, she thought, like a man who had not slept particularly well. The notebook, he said. Did you use it? I put it back where I found it. She said. In the frame. Something in his expression shifted. She thought it might have been relief, and then she thought it might have been something more complicated than relief, and then she stopped trying to categorize it. That I read Eleanor's letter. She said. The one Lady Margaret kept. I read it the night I found the notebook. That he was very still. She said what she needed to say. Helena continued. I think you should read it. I think. She stopped. Reconsidered. Started again. She ran out of time to tell you properly. But she found time to write it down. That seems like something worth knowing. You said. His voice was careful. Controlled in the way that voices became control. When the thing behind them was not. In the gallery. You said she knew it wasn't my fault. Yes, she wrote that. Yes. That he looked at her for a long moment. The corridor was very quiet. Somewhere in the house a clock ticked through the silence without resolving it. That I believed, he said slowly. For 3 years, that the last thing she felt was pain that I had caused. That the last thing she knew of me was. He stopped. His jaw tightened. It seemed like the appropriate conclusion, given the evidence was incomplete. Helena said, yes. He looked down at the floor briefly. So it appears. He was quiet for a moment. Then, why are you telling me this? You came here to. He paused. You did not come here with friendly intentions toward me. I am not unaware of that. Helena held his gaze. No. She said. I didn't, and yet, she agreed that he looked at her for another moment. His expression was doing several things she could not fully read. Then he said, quietly, "Thank you for telling me." He moved past her into the corridor. She stood in the doorway of the library and listened to his footsteps recede, and thought that thank you was perhaps the most undefended thing he had said to her since she arrived, and that it had cost him something to say it. And that she was not entirely sure what it meant that she had noticed the cost. The glasshouse was at the far edge of the kitchen garden, half hidden behind a yew hedge that had been allowed to grow higher than was strictly practical. Helena had discovered it in her third week at Ashburton Hall while looking for the herb garden Lady Margaret had mentioned, and had since developed a habit of going there in the evenings when the house felt too full of its own silence. It was not, strictly speaking, her space. But no one had told her it wasn't, and it had that quality of places that have been forgotten by the people who own them, a little overgrown, a little warm even in February, smelling of damp earth and something green and persistent that she could not name. She was there on a Thursday evening, 3 days after the corridor conversation, sitting on an overturned crate with Eleanor's letter in her hands. When she heard the door, she looked up. The Duke stood in the glasshouse doorway. He was not in evening dress, had the look of a man who had been working and had walked here without particularly deciding to. He looked at her. He looked at the letter. "Lady Margaret said you might be here," he said. "She has strong opinions about where people are." Helena said that he came inside. The glasshouse was not large, and his presence altered the dimensions of it in the way that his presence altered the dimensions of most spaces, not through imposing himself, but through a quality of density that meant you were always aware of exactly where he was. He did not sit. He stood near the far bench, among the dormant rose cuttings, with his hands in his pockets. I read it. He said. Helena did not ask what. She waited. I have been. He stopped. Started again. I have been trying to decide what to do with the information that she knew. That she wrote it down. That she. Another stop. I find that it does not make the thing easier in the way I might have expected. I thought. When I imagined someone finally saying those words to me. He looked at the glass ceiling, where condensation had gathered in long slow drops. I thought it would feel like a door opening. Instead it feels like being told that a room you have been locked out of was never actually locked. That you simply didn't try the handle. That seems worse, in some ways. Helena said, "Yes." He looked at her. "Yes, it is considerably worse." The glasshouse held its warmth around them. Outside, the February dark had settled over the kitchen garden, and the yew hedge was a black mass against the slightly lighter sky. I want to tell you what happened," he said. He seemed faintly surprised by his own sentence. "I have not told anyone. Not fully. Margaret knows some of it. The doctors knew the medical account. But the thing that I have carried. Specifically," he looked at his hands. "I would like to put it down somewhere. And you seem like a person who can hold things." Helena set the letter carefully on the crate beside her. "I am listening." She said that he was quiet for a moment. Then he began. "She had been ill for some time before we understood what the illness was," he said. "In the beginning it presented as headaches, as sensitivity to light. The first doctor said it was nerves. The second said it was the climate. By the 3rd year of our marriage I had a library shelf of medical texts and not a single one of them said anything definitive." He moved slightly. The slow restless movement of a man who thinks better in motion. She was despite everything, she was. He paused, and Helena thought she could see the effort of it, the reaching for words that would be accurate rather than simply protective. She was still herself. For a long time. The Eleanor who argued with me about estate management and read 3 books at once and had very strong opinions about the proper temperature for a dining room. She was still that person for most of it. The illness took things gradually. A lamp that was too bright. Then all lamps. A door shut too quickly. Then all sudden sounds. Then. He stopped. "I had learned," he said, after a moment. "To move carefully. To speak quietly. To knock before entering any room. I had learned all of it and I thought I understood the dimensions of what she needed. I thought his voice was precise and even. The voice of a man reciting something he has examined many times from a safe distance. I thought I knew the shape of it. And then one afternoon in March I came into the sitting room and she had been trying to rise from her chair for I don't know how long. Her arms were shaking. She looked exhausted. And I thought he stopped again. I thought I knew better than to let her continue to struggle when the solution was simple. I put my hand under her arm to help her stand. The glasshouse was very quiet, her whole body he pressed his mouth together. The precise voice had developed a crack in it. The way old porcelain cracked, fine, thorough, suddenly visible. She could not help it. I understood that, afterward. But in the moment I only knew that I had touched her and she had made a sound I had never heard her make before. A sound that he stopped. Breathed. She asked me to step back and I stepped back and I did not touch her again. Not that day. Not after. Helena did not move that I told myself it was for her sake. He said. That I was protecting her from the possibility of it happening again. And that was true. But it was also he looked at the rose cuttings on the bench beside him, their bare thorn stems. Their patient dormancy. It was also that I could not bear to cause that again. Not because I was afraid of her reaction. Because I thought I believed. In the way you believe things that feel like evidence that the fact of it happening meant that my touch was the problem. That I was the variable that had caused the harm. You weren't, Helena said. No. He said it flatly, without inflection. The way you said things you had just learned and had not yet integrated. No. I understand that now. The notebook. He paused. She wrote that it would have happened regardless. That her body had arrived at a point where any contact was another pause. I believe her. I find I believe her entirely. Which means 3 years of. He did not finish the sentence, Helena thought. A room you have been locked out of that was never actually locked. That I thought I knew better than her pain, he said. That is the thing I have not been able to put down. Not that it happened. But that I reached for her when she had not asked me to. Because I decided I knew what she needed better than she did. That is mine. That belongs to me regardless of what the notebook says. Yes, Helena said. It does. That he looked at her. She thought he had perhaps expected something other than agreement, but, she said. Deciding you knew what someone needed, and being wrong, and causing harm you didn't intend. That is a thing that people do. It is a terrible thing to have done. It is not the same as what the people in Bath believe you did. He was silent for a long moment. No. He said. I suppose it isn't. The condensation on the glass ceiling gathered and fell. Somewhere in the garden a night bird made a single sound and stopped. Why did you come here? He said. Not unkindly. As though he genuinely wanted to know and had decided that this was the moment to ask. Helena looked at the letter beside her. Eleanor had no one else to ask the questions. She said. And I needed. She stopped. Thought about what was true. I needed to know what had happened to her. She was my sister and I didn't know her and she died and the only story anyone was telling about it was wrong. And I couldn't. She stopped again. I couldn't let that be the only story. That he looked at her for a long time. That it was wrong, he said. You were right about that much. That I know. That he nodded, once, slowly. Then he said, thank you. For coming. And before she could answer he moved toward the glasshouse door. And then he stopped, with his hand on the frame, and said without turning, she was right about you. The notebook. She wrote something. About you. She said she had been a coward. That she should have written to you properly. That I know. Helena said. I read it. That I thought perhaps. He stopped. I thought perhaps you should know that she knew it. He paused. That she wrote it down. That he left. Helena sat in the glasshouse for a long time after. With the letter in her hands and the warmth around her and the night pressing gently against the glass, and she thought about a woman who had been selfish and ashamed of it and honest about both, and about a man who had just put something down that he had been carrying for 3 years. And about the fact that she had come here to make him speak and he had spoken and it had not felt like a victory. It had felt like something she did not yet have a word for. The letter from Lady Ashworth arrived on a Friday morning in March. And it changed the shape of everything. Helena knew none of this when she came downstairs to find Lady Margaret at the breakfast table with an expression she had not seen on her before, not quite worry, not quite anger, something that combined the two into a third thing with harder edges. Sit down. Lady Margaret said, Helena, Saturday there is to be a gathering at the Pembroke Rooms next Thursday. Lady Margaret said. The Pembroke assemblies are the largest of the Bath season. Half of society attends. She poured tea with the focused attention of someone who needed to be doing something with her hands. Lady Ashworth has written to say that she will be there. She has also written to say that She intends to ask Julian publicly, at the assembly, whether he has any intention of fulfilling what she describes as a long-standing understanding between their families. Meaning her daughter. Helena accepted the tea. Is there a long-standing understanding? There is a long-standing hope on Ashworth's part, which she has elevated to the status of understanding through repetition. Lady Margaret set the teapot down. Julian has never encouraged it. He has also never been sufficiently present in society to actively discourage it. Which she has chosen to interpret as encouragement. She looked at Helena. If she asks him publicly, he will have to answer publicly. And whatever he says will be in every drawing room in Bath by Friday morning. What will he say? That, Lady Margaret said, is what I am uncertain about. She was quiet for a moment. He has been different. These past weeks. Since the gallery. Since she paused. I don't know what passed between you in the glasshouse. I sent him there because it seemed like the right thing to do, and I have learned to trust that instinct. But he has been different. Helena looked at her teacup. Different how? He came to breakfast last Tuesday, Lady Margaret said. He has not come to breakfast in 2 years. He said good morning to the housemaid by name. She paused. He asked me, yesterday, whether I thought the East Gallery needed repainting. Helena looked up. He has been considering going back there. Lady Margaret said simply. I do not know whether he has. But he is considering it. The morning went on around them. Helena thought about Thursday's assembly in a way she told herself was practical. She would need to select a dress. She would need to be prepared to manage whatever social weather the evening produced, and not in any other way. She did not entirely succeed. The Pembroke Rooms were full, not full in the way of the smaller assemblies, where 60 people produced the impression of a crowd. Full in the way of a room that had been designed for a crowd and had received one, the chandeliers throwing light over 200 people in their best clothes. The musicians barely audible above the noise of 200 people performing sociability at their maximum amplitude. Helena found Lady Margaret near the entrance and stayed close to her. She was wearing the dress she had worn to the Carsworth party, the one she did not particularly like because it as the most suitable thing she owned, and she had made her peace with this. She wore no jewelry. She had left Eleanor's necklace in its box on her dresser, as she had left it every time before. Because the question of what it meant to wear it had not yet resolved itself into an answer she trusted. Lady Margaret had said nothing about the necklace. She had, however, pressed a small box into Helena's hands as they were leaving the house. Eleanor's necklace, Helena had said. Recognizing it, her will was specific. Lady Margaret said. I have been using my judgment about when to give it properly. I believe this is the right occasion. She had looked at Helena with an expression that did not invite discussion. It is yours. It has been yours. She wanted you to have it. Helena had looked at the box for a long moment. And then she had opened it, and taken out the necklace, green stones set in gold, old and precise and quietly beautiful, and put it on. She had not looked in the mirror afterward. Now, in the Pembroke Rooms, she was aware of it against her collarbone in the way you were aware of something that had weight beyond its physical weight. She did not see the Duke when they arrived. This was not unusual, had a capacity for being present in large rooms without being locatable in them. She spoke to 2 women he had been introduced to at previous assemblies. She accepted a glass of something and held it. Lady Ashworth swept by at one point with a daughter in tow, a pleasant-faced girl who looked as though she would have preferred to be somewhere else, and inclined her head at Lady Margaret with the smile of S. Omion, who believed the evening was going to proceed according to her intentions. That it was during the second set of dances that she found him. She was not dancing. She had positioned herself near the edge of the room where the crowd thinned, watching the movement of the floor with the particular attention of someone who was watching for a specific thing among many things. When she became aware that the crowd near the entrance had shifted in the way crowds shifted when they were making room for a new subject of interest, the Duke had come in from the card room. He was looking for something. Or someone. She could see it in the quality of his attention, directed, purposeful, moving through the room with the efficiency of a man who had made a decision. Then his attention landed on her, and stopped. He walked toward her. She did not look away. It seemed, at this point, unnecessary. He was perhaps 10 feet from her when he stopped. She watched him take in the necklace, the green stones against the white of her dress. His face did not change. She was learning to read the changes that did not register on his face, the ones that lived in the quality of his stillness. And then he moved again, closed the remaining distance, and said nothing. He held out his hand. Helena looked at it. I don't know if you dance, he said. His voice was very level. She had come to understand that his voice became very level when it was doing the most work. I do, she said. Then he paused. If you're willing. She gave him her hand. He led her onto the floor. She was aware of the shift in the room, the recalibration of attention. The Duke of Ashburton, who had stood at the edges of 3 assemblies and spoken to no one, leading someone onto the floor. She did not look at the other guests. She looked at him. He danced correctly and without apparent self-consciousness, which surprised her. She had expected rigidity. Instead there was an ease that suggested he had once done this comfortably, and the ease had simply been dormant rather than lost. They did not speak for the first movement of the dance. Then he said, quietly, in the way that could not be heard past the two of them, the necklace, Lady Margaret gave it to me tonight. I see. A pause. She has strong opinions about timing. She mentioned that the will was specific. That it was. He was looking past her shoulder with the attention of a man who was navigating both a dance floor and a conversation with equal care. I did. Not when the solicitor read it. I did not. He stopped. Tried again. I arranged for it to be held until another stop. I was not certain you would come. I was not certain you existed. In the way that people you have heard of but never met don't quite exist until they do. I put the necklace with Margaret because Margaret manages things that I am not able to manage. Helena turned with the movement of the dance. When you saw it just now, she said. When you saw me wearing it, yes, what did you think? He looked at her then directly, fully. The 3-second look fully arrived and not departing. That I thought, he said carefully, that you look like yourself. Not like her. Like yourself. Wearing something that was hers. He paused. I found that he stopped. The dance turned them apart briefly and then back. When they were close again he said, I found that I was glad you were wearing it. I am still determining what that means. The music continued. Around them the Pembroke rooms were full of light and conversation and the movement of 200 people going about the business of a Bath assembly. The Duke danced with Helena and said not hing further, but his hand, Helena noticed, did not hold hers with the careful minimal contact of a man discharging a social obligation. It held hers the way a man held something he had decided he was allowed to hold. When the dance ended and he walked her back to the edge of the room, he did not immediately release her hand. He held it for one moment past the point of necessity. Then he let go, and inclined his head, and said, thank you. You've said that to me before. Helena said that I find I keep having reasons to, he said. And walked back into the room. Helena stood at the edge of the Pembroke assembly with the warmth of his hand still present in hers, and Eleanor's necklace at her throat, and the green stones catching the light of the chandeliers. And thought that she had come to Ashburton Hall to make a man speak and had somehow, without deciding to, made herself stay. The carriage home from the Pembroke rooms was quiet in the way that carriages were quiet after evenings that had contained more than expected. Lady Margaret was not performing sleep this time. She was awake and looking out her window with the expression of a woman reviewing a Series of events and finding them satisfactory. She said nothing for the first 10 minutes. The Duke sat across from Helena with his arms folded and his eyes directed at the passing dark. As he had in every carriage on every evening prior, except that tonight he had danced with her, and his hand had held hers one moment past necessity, Helena looked at the window on her side and thought about neither of these things with great discipline. It was Lady Margaret who spoke first. And what she said was, "Lady Ashworth will not let Thursday rest. No. The Duke said, she will interpret tonight as confirmation of something. She will make it known that I expect so, Julian." Lady Margaret's voice had shifted into the register she used when she had been patient for a long time and had reached the edge of it. "I have watched you manage the last 3 years. By doing nothing, saying nothing, and hoping that silence would eventually become its own answer. It has not. It will not. Lady Ashworth is going to force a public conversation, and if you do not decide what you intend to say, she will say it for you. And it will be the wrong thing." The Duke looked at his folded arms. "I am aware, are you?" It was not a question that he did not answer immediately. The carriage moved through the dark Devon lanes. And the sound of the wheels on the road filled the space where his answer should have been. Then he said, without moving, "Miss Ward." Helena looked at him. That he was looking at her now directly, the full quality of his attention, which she had come to understand was a different thing from other people's attention, more present, harder to sustain under. "That I have been trying," he said, "to determine when I became someone who notices where you are in a room before I notice anything else in the room. I have not been able to identify the specific occasion." Helena said nothing. "That I have been trying to determine when the house became." He stopped. "When it stopped feeling like a verdict, eh? And he began feeling like a place where someone I wanted to speak to might be found." He paused. "Lady Margaret would say I am being indirect." "You are being indirect," Lady Margaret said, without looking away from her window. "That I am aware." He unfolded his arms. He looked at his hands briefly. The way he had in the glasshouse, with that quality of examining them for information. "When you came here," he said, "you did not have friendly intentions toward me. You said so yourself." "That I did, and now," Helena looked at him across the carriage. "Now," she said, "I have read your wife's notebook and her letter and spoken to your aunt and watched you stand at the edges of 3 assemblies and come to breakfast on a Tuesday. And I have been trying to determine." She stopped. "I have been trying to determine when you stopped being the subject of an investigation and became someone I was concerned about." Something shifted in his expression. Not quite a smile. Something more careful than a smile, but in the same direction. "That is," he began. "That I have not finished." Helena said. "That he stopped." "That I came here with a specific intention," she said. "I told myself it was on Eleanor's behalf. And perhaps it was, in the beginning. But I have read what she wrote. And I have spoken to you in the glasshouse and in corridors and in carriages, and I believe." She stopped. Tried again. "I think the story I was telling myself about why I was still here stopped being accurate some weeks ago." The carriage moved through the dark. "Helena," he said. It was the first time he had used her name without her title, and it arrived differently than expected, not as a liberty but as something precise, a word that meant what it said. "Yes," she said. "That I find." He stopped. The careful voice, the level voice, had developed that crack in it again. "I find that I am not that I should not." He pressed his mouth together. Tried again. "I cannot ask you to take a name that the world has already decided belongs to a particular story. I cannot ask you to walk into rooms where people will look at you and think of he are and decide things about you based on what they have decided about me." He looked at her steadily. "I cannot ask you to do that." "You are not asking me," Helena said. "That I am aware that I am not asking. I am explaining why I cannot ask." "You are explaining," Helena said. "Why you have already decided on my behalf what I am and am not willing to do." That he was very still. "That is not. You told me, in the glasshouse, that you touched her because you thought you knew better than her pain what she needed." Helena kept her voice even. "I am telling you that I have read her notebook and her letter, and I have had 6 weeks in this house to form my own opinion, and if you decide, on my behalf, that I cannot manage what comes with knowing you." She paused. "Then you are making the same mistake twice. Only this time the person asking you not to make it is in the room and capable of saying so directly. The silence in the carriage had a different quality now. Lady Margaret continued to look out her window with the serene expression of someone who had anticipated this conversation and found its execution satisfactory. The Duke looked at Helena for a long moment. "You are," he said. He stopped. Looked at his hands again. "I have not been told directly not to make a mistake since Eleanor told me I was wrong about the temperature of the dining room, and she was correct, and I conceded. I find the experience." He paused. "I find it unexpectedly clarifying." "Good." "Helena said that I am still concerned," he said. "About what you would be walking into." "Did I know the story that people tell?" "I know the story," Helena said. "I spent 2 years researching it. I know it better than most of the people telling it." She looked at him. "I also know the actual account. I am in a better position than anyone in Bath to decide what weight to give each of them." That he was quiet for a long moment. Outside, the lights of Ashburton Hall appeared at the end of the lane, the windows lit against the dark. "That I have not," he began, and stopped, and then said, with some difficulty, as though the sentence were being assembled from components that did not usually sit together. "I have not wanted to be somewhere this specifically in a very long time." Helena looked at the approaching lights. "Nor have I," she said. "And found, upon examination, that it was entirely true," Lady Margaret said, serenely, to no one in particular. "I will have tea sent to the sitting room." The Ashworth gathering was held on a Saturday afternoon, in the rooms above the pump room that Lady Ashworth had taken for the season, and it was attended by what Helena estimated, from her position near Lady Margaret, to be approximately 40 people, small enough that conversations carried, large enough that the carrying was not impolite. Lady Ashworth held her rooms the way certain women held rooms, as territory. She was 60, perhaps. With the particular brightness of a woman who had learned that brightness was the most effective form of armor. And she had positioned herself near the center of the gathering with her daughter beside her and an expression of social command that suggested she had been looking forward to this afternoon for several days. The Duke had come. Helena had not been certain he would. He had said nothing on the subject since the carriage conversation 3 nights ago, and the intervening days had been quiet in the particular way of Ashburton Hall, with the difference that he had come to breakfast twice more and had, on one occasion, stopped in the corridor outside the library to ask Helena what she was reading with the air of a man who was practicing something. That he stood now near the window of Lady Ashworth's rooms, speaking to an elderly gentleman about something that appeared to involve drainage. And Helena stood near Lady Margaret and watched Lady Ashworth watching him with the focused calculation of a woman approaching a scheduled event. That it came during the second hour, "Your Grace." Lady Ashworth had navigated the room with the efficiency of a ship finding favorable wind. Her daughter eyed her with the resigned expression of someone who had not been consulted about the itinerary. "How wonderful that you've joined us today. We see so little of you in Bath, Lady Ashworth." The Duke's voice was courteous and revealed nothing. "That I was saying to Lord Pembroke only last week that we must make more effort to draw you out." She smiled. "A man of your standing should not be sequestered. It is not good for Devon, and it is certainly not good for Bath." She paused. The pause of a woman arriving at her prepared material. "I hope we have all hoped that we might see you more settled this season. More future-minded." Several nearby conversations had softened. Helena, across the room, felt the quality of the gathering shift, the specific attentiveness of a room deciding to listen. "Lady Ashworth," the Duke said, pleasantly, "I find I am more future-minded than I have been in some years." Lady Ashworth's smile adjusted slightly. This was not the response she had prepared for. "How gratifying. Then perhaps you would do Cecily the honor of—" "I intend to be married," the Duke said. The nearby conversation stopped entirely. Lady Ashworth's smile held. "How wonderful. I had hoped—" "I intend to be married," the Duke said again, with the same level pleasantness. To Miss Helena Ward, the quality of silence in Lady Ashworth's rooms was the silence of 40 people simultaneously deciding not to be the first to speak. Helena, across the room, felt the green stones of the necklace against her collarbone. Lady Ashworth's smile underwent a structural adjustment. I am not certain Helena Ward-ish is the companion. She is Eleanor's sister, the Duke said. And she is herself. He turned then, fully, and looked across the room at Helena with the directness of a man who had decided that looking at things was preferable to looking away from them. If she is willing, the 40 people in Lady Ashworth's rooms turned. In the manner of people following the direction of a statement to its destination, Helena stood near Lady Margaret and felt herself looked at by 40 people and looked at by him. Which were two very different experiences occurring simultaneously. She thought about the notebook hidden behind a portrait frame, she thought about for H, if she ever comes, she thought about a man in a corridor all night, and a shelf of worn medical books. And the way he had said her name in a carriage as though it were a word he had been waiting to use correctly. She thought about Eleanor writing I should have known her better and then leaving her the necklace and the instruction to come. Which was perhaps the most Eleanor thing anyone could have done too late, slightly roundabout, and in the end precisely what was needed, she said. You just said Eleanor's name, the Duke, across the room. Held her gaze. I did, you said you couldn't that I said a great many things that I have since revised. A pause. I find that her name is manageable. When the context is right. Something moved through his expression, not quite loss, not quite peace. Something that had passed through both and arrived somewhere quieter. She would have had opinions about this afternoon, I think. Strong ones. Almost certainly correct ones. She would have found the whole thing slightly obvious. Helena said, something happened to his expression. The something that was not quite a smile arrived more fully this time. Yes. He said. She would have 40 people in Lady Ashworth's rooms continued to stand in the silence that followed, two people speaking to each other across a crowded space as though the crowded space were not there. Lady Ashworth said, faintly, this is most I'm not certain. Miss Ward, the Duke said. Ignoring this with the ease of a man who had decided what he was doing and found the minor obstacles uninteresting. I owe you an apology, Helena waited that I have spent 3 years, he said, with the precision of a man measuring each word. Deciding what I could and could not do. Could not speak. Could not be present in rooms. Could not. He paused. I have recently come to understand that could not and would not are different statements. And that I have been using the former as a shelter for the latter. He held her gaze across the room. I would not let myself speak of her because speaking meant she was gone, and that I had not been able to prevent it. And that the last thing I had done before she died was cause her pain. And as long as I did not speak of it, it remained a thing that was happening rather than a thing that had happened. He paused. You came here and you read her words and you told me what she had written. And you did not tell me that I was forgiven, you told me that she had known the truth, and that is. He stopped. That is a different and considerably more useful thing. The room was very still. That I am not a man who manages these things gracefully, he said. I am aware of this. I am telling you now. In front of 40 people I am largely indifferent to, because I find that I have been using private spaces to say private things for long enough, and it occurs to me that some things are better said where they cannot be taken back. Helena looked at him. She thought, he is doing this here. Specifically, because here is where the story has been wrong, she thought. He is saying her name in the room where people stopped saying it, and he is saying mine in the same breath, and he is asking the room to hold both. You have strong opinions about dining room temperatures. She said. The not quite smile arrived completely. I do. He said, and estate drainage, extensively, and the proper management of difficult people. That I have been told I require improvement in this area. A pause. I am open to instruction. Helena crossed the room. She was aware of the 40 people. She was aware of Lady Ashworth making a sound like a pu. Ntured bellows. She was aware of Lady Margaret, near the door, wearing the expression of a woman whose judgment had been thoroughly vindicated. She stopped in front of him, she said, quietly enough that only he could hear. Eleanor wrote that she was afraid you would be free. And that she was ashamed of that fear. He looked at her. Something moved through him, she could see it, the way the information landed and settled and changed the shape of something internal. I know, he said. Just as quietly, she also wrote that she hoped you would forgive her for it. He was silent for a moment. Then, she didn't need to ask. I know, Helena said. I thought you should say it out loud. That he looked at her for a long moment, then he said, in a voice that was not level. That had abandoned level entirely. She was right to leave me the necklace, she usually was. Helena said, yes. His eyes did not leave her face. She was allowed to the room, he said. Miss Ward has agreed to marry me. That I haven't said yes yet, Helena said. You crossed the room. He said, that was curiosity. Miss Ward, yes, she said. All right. Yes, Lady Margaret said, from near the door, in the tone of a woman closing a book she had enjoyed. I'll have the solicitor contacted on Monday. Lady Ashworth sat down in a nearby chair with the abruptness of someone whose afternoon had not proceeded according to plan. Her daughter, Helena noticed, looked genuinely pleased. And mouthed something that appeared to be congratulations before her mother could redirect her attention. The room began to make noise again, the specific noise of 40 people processing an unexpected development and deciding what it meant for their existing social narratives. Helena stood in the middle of it and looked at the Duke of Ashburton, who was looking at her with the particular expression of a man who had arrived somewhere he had not believed he was permitted to go. That he offered her his arm, she took it. The necklace caught the afternoon light green stones, old gold. The weight of something passed from one hand to another, and Helena thought that Eleanor had been right. About the necklace. About her coming. About most things. She had been a coward, Eleanor had written. She should have known her better, Helena thought. I know you now. It was late. And it was roundabout, and it was entirely typical of you. But I know you now, the Duke said, quietly, for her ears only. Thank you for coming. You've said that before as well. She said. That I find, he said, that it keeps being true, outside the pump room windows. Bath went about it Saturday afternoon, indifferent and ordinary and entirely unaware that in the rooms above it, a man had said a name he had not said in 3 years, and the world had not ended, and something that had been locked for a very long time had simply, finally, opened.